Hi everyone, we are here today with author Peter Tamburro, who has authored the series on Forward Chess, Openings for Amateurs, a trilogy that started in 2014 was the first one was released, and the latest one was 2024. So we have 10 years, 3 books. We're going to hear all about them and about you, Peter. So welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Charlize. Nice to be here.
So we are on the Forward Chess web reader. Here are your 3 books, but let's start by talking about how this series started. What inspired you to write this opening series?
It all started with an interview, actually. It goes back to another interview series, chess.fm, which no longer exists, but at the time they were doing interview series, and the book dealer Fred Wilson was going to start a series, and he asked me to be the first guest. And there was a fellow, Tony Hines, who was the producer of all of this. After the interview was over, he said, Pete, can I talk to you for a second? And I said, sure. And he said, look, you have a great radio voice.
You do.
And
First thought.
And yeah, I guess it's nice and deep. And he said, how would you like to do a show on chess.fm? Maybe do chess history or something like that. And I said, I don't think people want to do chess history. I said, let me do something on openings, because there's one thing you can bank on in chess. Most people like to talk about openings. Because we still have a dream that we're somehow going to win in 20 moves and go out to eat lunch and enjoy ourselves. So I thought I would try and contribute to that fantasy and write about openings for amateurs. My highest rating was just a shade over 2100. I never really thought about doing the work necessary to be a master, although sometimes, I would beat a bunch of masters, but it was just not something I wanted to do. I had too many other professional responsibilities and family responsibilities and stuff like that. So you can't spend weekends away from your family or your profession, as I found out.
Yeah.
And so I did openings for amateurs and decided to try and explain openings, because at the time, this was around 2005. At the time, we were in love with database dumping for openings books. And people were buying it. All the secret codes are in there, but nobody really understood the openings.
Yeah.
So what I thought I would do is I would do these lessons on chess.fm, and I explain the openings, why people go where they go. And it worked really well. I had over 5,000 listeners from close to 70 or 80 countries.
Wow.
I always remember being astonished that there was one guy from Africa who was listening to my lecture on the Ruy Lopez, and his country was in the middle of a civil war.
Wow. And you straight
And
against
I'm
chess.
thinking, yes, chess players are indeed nuts. And so I realized that was the way to go, because people like the fact that I didn't talk down to them. I didn't get lost in endless variations. I tried to pick openings that the average club player, like around 1100 to 1800, somewhere in there, would be comfortable playing, where the principles involved are easy. You kind of get the idea of what things are about, because you always used to notice a lot of club players would gravitate to the Cole system. And later years, it would be the London system or the Cole-Zukertort system, things that they can trot out, 10 moves and not be mated. That was a signal achievement for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Most masters don't think in those terms. And people really liked it. They liked it because I would talk about what the demands of the position were, or I talk about the principles that were in the position. And then I started to realize we have in New Jersey a World Amateur Team Championship. It's the biggest team tournament in the United States. We had a huge number just this past February as well. And it's like 350 or 360 teams. And
Teams, not even players. Those are the amount of teams.
yeah, oh yeah, oh no, we had
Wow.
about 1,500 players or something like that. We
Mm.
take over an entire Hilton hotel. And it's really astonishing to watch. But one of my jobs was I was editor of the Atlantic Chess News, which I had helped start back in 1973. And I had come back to do it, to help it keep going. I started collecting the game scores and then going through the game scores. And I developed my 10 move rule, which kind of came in the middle of all these openings for amateurs collections. And I started to notice from going over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of amateur games that they would be able to go maybe 10 or 12 moves, and then they had no idea what they were doing. Like, for example, one of my favorites is the dragon with the St. George attack. You know, they could castle queenside, and they have their pawn on F3, and then G4 and H4, and they have the bishop on E3 and the queen on D2, and they know to go to H6, and you know, the whole business. But once they got 10 moves, they had no idea why they were there. And as a matter of fact, you would find that they didn't know even before that, because I started teaching my chess students the accelerated dragon, which means you don't play D6. You hold it in abeyance, and if they follow their little St. George pattern that they've memorized, you could play D5 in one move and completely equalize the position. So, and there's the wonderful examples of that in the third book, where I actually include 24 games from the amateur, you know, because I like to use master games and some really good amateur games in my other books. And I did in this one, too. Most of the games are that, because they're good model games. It's good to follow good players' games.
Yeah.
But I put these 24 games here just to show, you know, what I'm talking about. And these games are perfect examples. You'll get people that understand the opening and play it, people that don't understand the opening, and the same mistakes are made over and over again. In my first Openings for Amateurs book, I decided I would play on the ICC a ton of games with people of all stripes, but mostly I aimed for, you know, the amateur rank. And I started noticing patterns. People were making the same types of mistakes, and I started encoding them. And I have, as a matter of fact, in the second book, I put how to raise your rating 100 points without studying the openings. And there's a list of 20 items in there. And if you just follow the first 4, your rating will go up 100 points. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious. It's in the back of the book. It's on page 298.
Wow. How to raise your rating 100 points.
There it is.
Studying openings.
So,
that's catchy. Okay, so we've got tips here.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was chess teaching, I mean, I go over to the games with the players, and my God, did you look at all the checks, captures, and forced moves? No, you know,
Yeah.
you know,
Multiple
and
things to do before memorizing any openings.
yeah, in other words, you have to develop a routine
Yeah.
when you're at the board. If you don't develop a routine, I mean, I didn't invent this idea. You know, you can read people like C.J.S. Purdy from Australia or Weaver Adams from America, and probably, you know, a bunch of Russian books or German books or whatever, probably have the same idea. Here I felt it was necessary to do this, but all of these points were based on actual games. And then in the third book, you know, I made a particular point of saying, well, here's Rule 12, here's Rule 12 going out the window, and here's Rule 4 going, you know, not being, and these were masters doing it.
So you made the point of in the actual games, you would highlight these.
Yeah, actually, in the actual games, you'll find, you know, where it was appropriate, not in every single game.
Yeah.
But where it was appropriate, I would put what rule they didn't follow, just so people realize I'm not blowing smoke about all this stuff. And it could really improve your play. It's this kind of attention to a routine that makes you successful. Now, that's a heck of a thing for somebody writing about openings, but I still felt as a chess teacher that I had to mention this. So that's how I got involved with trying to make it understandable for the average player. I think that's really important. I know when I did a section on the Vienna, I put, you know, here's your plan. You know, here are the things, or sometimes it's equal. None of this is how to win in the chess openings. All right.
Unrealistic to an expectation.
Yeah, there's a quote that I got from Cook's compendium of the chess openings, which was done, in the first decade of the 20th century. He says, there is no opening that wins for white. There is no opening that wins for black. And that's basically true. What you have to realize is that anyone that sells you a book saying you'll win all your games, that's crazy. And then a lot of opening repertoire books give the idea that somehow this is going to work, this is going to work, and they don't really look at the opening books that say how to defend against that.
Right.
And I collected an awful lot of opening books, and I would just one of my favorite moments was when I did a review of Lev Albert's opening series. He had done a wonderful book on the Pierce defense, and it's a classic. It's one of the best opening books ever done from the black point of view. And he talks about black's position being good, and white shouldn't play H3 because it's just a wasting, of tempo and the whole business like that. And then he came out with a white repertoire. And you get to the same position, and he says, well, white should play H3 here, to stop the bishop coming to G4. And it's like, I wrote in the review, okay, I don't have a dog in this hunt, but I'd love to know which one it is, which is correct. So sometimes people get carried away by their opening books. And even Steinitz was that way in the tournament book of 1889. You can find contradictions in his notes in the same position. Maybe he didn't like the guy who was playing that game or whatever, but he would do it, and we all do it. So it's not like you don't have to be careful when you read an opening book, but the fundamental idea is that I picked openings that people could be comfortable with playing, that wouldn't require super sophistication, and that would give them an equal chance to win as the other guy. And what I said was, if you understand why you're playing the opening, and then you'll probably win, because most of the people you're playing won't. So I don't guarantee wins, but I give you the opportunity to do that. And then clean up your act in the openings on other things. In the first openings for amateurs, I had an entire section, what I called the primer, where I took actual examples from all my ICC games and said, look at this, look at this, look at this. And these are all practical tips. Even things like don't be an opening robot, which is really important, or don't panic against unusual moves. When is it good to exchange a bishop for a knight? When can you play H3 and G4? These are things, I picked those because they kept appearing in the games. And I'm a great fan of studying games and seeing what patterns appear. And then, of course, the central focus of all the books is the model games themselves. The model games are a lot of grandmaster games, some master games, and a few amateur games. They're games that give you something to take away, not a line to memorize, but an idea to remember and to conceptualize, because that'll get you through stuff. In the second and third books, I started to get a little bit more sophisticated, in the sense I started talking about understanding isolated queen pawn games, understanding what the queenside pawn majority is, what the minority attack is. And we did a lot on the isolated queen pawn, because a lot of amateurs shy away from that, because we've always been told that, if you have your little pawn on D4 and it doesn't have its little friends protecting it, black is going to dump a piece right in front of it and going to rule the game from there. Well, not all the time, no. So I picked the Carol Khan as a perfect example of showing how past grandmasters used the isolated queen pawn. Many years ago, in 1975, I took, along with Jeff Kastner, the two of us were the chaperones for a group of young high school stars. And among them were Ron Henley and Michael Rode and Kenny Regan and John Tisdall and Mark Deason. These are people that would all become titled players. And I remember I played in the amateur section. They played in the master section. And I remember Mike Rode won the master section, and I tied for first in the amateur section. What happened was I had to go home at the end of the round, and I had to be with these kids that wanted to go over my games with me. And two of the people that always wanted to was Kenny Regan, who became an IM. He could have become a grandmaster easily, but he decided to become a professor at a university instead. And I understood that. And Ron Henley. And Ron was 17 years old, and he was studying chess very hard. He stayed at my house for a couple of weeks, and he would go over the games. I ended up with an isolated queen pawn as white, and he would ask me, well, why didn't you play your knight to e5 here? I always remember that. And he explained to me the good and the bad parts of the isolated queen pawn, and I started to understand. I mean, it was really interesting. So I developed this idea is that there are aspects to chess that we're missing. And one of them is that when people play in tournaments today, especially kids, and there's so many more kids in tournaments today, I think the adults have fled in a lot of tournaments in the U.S. anyhow, because they don't want to lose to a kid.
No one wants to lose to kids.
I had a girl that she was 12 years old, and she played in the New Jersey Open, and she demolished, and she had a rating like 1,400. And she absolutely demolished an expert. I don't know whether that guy ever showed up again in the tournament. But that's,
Stays with you when you lose to a kid. Yeah.
Just a sweet little thing. But what was interesting is that you notice when the kids are done with their games, they disappear. They go find their computer, turn on Chess Base, and they go over the game and say, oh, I should have played that here. They have no idea why they should have played it there, just that the chess engine said so. And my growth as a chess player was at a club where the older players would talk to the younger players, or after your game was over in whatever tournament you were playing in, your opponent would say, well, let's go find a Skittles room and go over the game. They don't even have Skittles rooms anymore. Some of these, because nobody bothers. Go find your chess coach or, whatever. Yeah, it's like, well, find out what your opponent was thinking, because frankly, they were more involved in the game than your chess coach was. But at least know what was on their minds. So I tried to make these books a sharing opportunity. Play through these games. And that's the other thing. You got to play through chess games. Yeah. I'm sorry. It's a necessity. And the reason is, I remember I had a young expert that was a student of mine, obviously doing very well. He was, like a sophomore in high school or something like that. And he wanted to show me his game. So, okay. So we went over the game, and it reached a point where he had an isolated queen pawn, and he played and won it. But at one point in the game, I said, have you ever gone over the game Reddy Spielman, where he takes his knight on d4 and chops off the knight on c6, and after b takes c6, you've got a backward c6 pawn, and what you're doing is translating to a different kind of situation where you can now take advantage of the backward c6 pawn to a greater degree. I'm sorry, black had the isolated pawn, but it never occurred to them that you could actually undo the isolated pawn for your opponent, but in exchange, you get a translation into a different kind of advantage.
Yeah.
And so I ended up putting that game in book 2. But they don't know the old games. They ignore them because they're a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's scary how many good games were played a long time ago that are frankly easier to understand than modern games.
Yeah, they're more human, you would say.
Pardon?
Without the engines, because I think a lot of, especially the younger kids, looking back at old games that might not necessarily have been as accurate as today's games,
right.
and all of that, but they were more human, I would say, and in many ways.
You're absolutely right.
Beautiful.
And they say, oh, well, this guy made a mistake here and there. And you know, it's funny, I deeply regret I was doing something for British Chess Magazine because I had my openings column there for 10 years. Amos Byrne, the anniversary of his death is coming up in November, and we're thinking about putting a memorial to Amos Byrne in there. So I went looking for some of his games, and much to my chagrin, I found this great game that he played with the isolated queen pawn attack with the idea of rook to a3. And this is like in 1912. I couldn't find an earlier example. And I wasn't aware of the game. I don't know why I wasn't aware of the game, but I felt like I had sinned because I would have put that sucker right in the front of the IQP section. And if we ever do another edition, I will add that game. It is remarkable. But I hope to put it in BCM for November, but we'll see. But here was this guy, because what I had put in my book in the IQP section is I put a game as a note. We didn't have the room to fully annotate the game. It was a win by Walter Brown, where he does not only the isolated queen pawn attack, but he does the rook lift to a3, and then he has this tremendous kingside attack and sacks the house and wins. And Brown in his book annotates the thing, and it was so complicated that, he freely admitted he couldn't figure it all out, and I figure, well, I don't want to put that in the book because then, it's just too much. And what's interesting about Byrne, though, is he gets into a decisive position for the attack and then doesn't pick the right move. So it's not going into his collection of best games, so to speak, maybe. But instead of that, he doesn't give up and he creates yet another attack. Now, a lot of young people might look, oh, he screwed it up, so let's just go back to the beginning and see what he should have done. Yeah, but then they're missing the second attack. The guy came up with 2 different kingside attacks in the same game. What a marvelous game. There's your lesson game. There are all sorts of lessons. My favorite game from the earlier volume, the Next Steps thing, is I have a game between Janowski and Lasker, Emmanuel Lasker. Janowski plays the Cole Zukertort attack. CJS Purdy used to have something, what he used to call the all-purpose defense. If you don't know what you're doing, E6, D5, C5, put the knights on F6, and the whole business. Yeah, and you could just defend. There's no reason you should lose with that. But anyhow, Lasker sets this up, and then Cholovich is talking about the world championship match with Karyakin. They end up into this position, the all-purpose defense to the CZ attack. And Cholovich says, well, White didn't want to go here because or Black didn't want to go there because he knew White would know what to do. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, maybe White would know what to do, but how about the people that are average players that are looking at it? And so I realized that the Janowski-Lasker game was perfect because Lasker develops everything with a purpose. Like, he sets the initial setup, and that's where most amateurs stop. But Lasker has a reason for where he's putting every single piece. Not all the games have to be wins, and this was such a well-played game. And you learn a gazillion lessons about how to play the all-purpose defense and why you do it and the whole business. And oddly enough, it reminded me, and I think I made that point, of a game Benko had played against the Stonewall attack. And in the last round of the U.S. Open in '94, some master played this against me. And I'm thinking, oh my, this is going to be the Benko game. It wasn't going to be the exact same moves, but at least I had a grasp on the position.
You could relate to an actual game played by actual.
And I was fortunate because I got to hang out with a lot of grandmasters and IMs and very strong players. Because living in New Jersey, New York, I was a member of the Marshall Chess Club, Westfield Chess Club. These were all very strong clubs, obviously, and it was important to play over games. Because what would these people do? They would play over games. And they would talk about it. What if it was exciting because you were forced to think on your own. And then in later years, and that was back in the 70s, once the chess-based stuff started to come along, we hosted a futurity tournament for young players, and we invited some grandmasters to come. I'm watching the young players between rounds, and they all have their laptops out, and
Hmm.
they all have whatever opening they're looking at, but they're whizzing through these games. It's like they were just looking at the moves of the game without thinking,
Hmm.
getting the idea of how the positions develop and what ideas were in there very quickly. Then they go to the next game. You know, they weren't spending a whole lot of time. They were just seeing how do certain patterns emerge, I think, that will help them understand whatever they were studying.
Yeah.
And they would go through, like, you know, in between rounds, they go through like 50 games in an hour. And I realized then what they were doing. I think there's a term in psychology about Gestalt, where you kind of had a total image of something, and it appears not as a line of analysis, but as an image. And these images kind of make a place for themselves in your brain. And then you know, I've seen that before.
Yeah.
You know, and then I remember what the image looks like 10 moves later, so I know where all the stuff is going to be going.
Yeah.
So, you know, I try very hard to try and get that across. In this last volume, I did one on Capablanca against the Open Ruy Lopez. He spent time talking in his book, Chess Fundamentals, that what he wanted to do in this game and another game was to take advantage of Black's inability to get C5 in, for example, and how he developed his plan based on just that idea. And he made it look simple because he understood it. And when you play over Capablanca games, you get a lot of lessons.
Hmm.
He's magnificent in terms of long-term positional planning. So I did my best to introduce positional play because most chess players don't buy books on positional play. I'm sorry, it doesn't.
Yeah.
They they
Difficult
equate
one.
they equate it with boredom,
Yeah.
and that's a serious error. So I got really great games to play, and you can learn positional chess with the isolated queen pawn or queenside pawn majority, and you can see Bill Martz. This I just think this is just a wonderful positional chess lesson.
Wow.
You know, and if you look at that, why did he spend all that time castling queenside and then putting knights on B1 and C1? What the heck are those knights doing there?
Where are they
And then the plan unfolds, and it's all about those weak dark squares on A5 and B6, and then of course C6, the light square has its problems too. And if you go through this game, first of all, one knight gets up there and does its job, and then the next knight gets up there. You know, if you play through the moves, uh, it's just so much fun to watch because,
going?
yeah. And now, if as the game continues, what? Stop right there. Did you see that? Of course you did. But knight takes bishop. In other words, how many amateurs are going to even think of the idea of taking the most beautifully posted knight in the world
Yeah,
and
this bishop.
taking a bishop on d8? Well, why would he do that? Well, there's a great reason, and let's continue the game just a little bit. And he puts the queen back on a5 again. And he's doing the same thing. Now watch what happens. Yeah, play through the moves. And look at that knight. It's coming out. Guess where it's going? He exchanges.
Another one. Hmm.
Boom, the next knight goes in there.
Okay, so
That's
this is the idea
positional play.
between B1, C1, and knights all the
Yeah,
time.
I
Let's
mean,
get to A5.
yeah, it's a wonderful lesson. It's
Wow.
easy to understand, and you think in terms of weak squares.
Yeah.
And he just destroys the guy after that. You know, so that's
Wow.
uh
Beautiful game.
isn't it? I mean, I was stunned. And that's an unpublished game, by the way. You won't find that in ChessBase.
Oh, from his notebook.
Andy Ansel and I do this infrequent column on past masters of U.S. players in American Chess Magazine, and I annotate the games, but he selects them, and he selected this gem. I mean, oh man, can
Wow.
this guy pick a game?
Yeah.
And so it's you know, it's really exciting, and if you go if you keep going down the pages, we go to the next game. Silman, Jeremy Silman against Strenswick, and here's a dragon. Now, the diagram after move 15. Now, what amateur is going to go into this position as black?
No, I mean, I would take this as white any day.
But because all they see are triple pawns,
Mm-hmm.
look terribly weak, and then Silman turns it into a great advantage because he understands that he has a lot of possibilities because the dragon bishop is on an open diagonal, and he's got all these wonderful open lines, and he can look at that position and realizes, at some point, he has a knight on heading towards d5, whatever, and it's just, and there it is. Amateurs will look at 3 triple pawns.
And these
Silman looks at posting a knight on d5 with a tremendous bishop on a diagonal. So, so I keep looking for stuff like that. And that was another game that Andy found. So we can keep going down. I just want to show you what's interesting about the other games in here. Oh, yeah, this is wonderful. And I called this the symmetry trap. This is a game Reshevsky played against Stahlberg. I love this. Now look at this position, okay? White and black, perfectly symmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe some guys might offer a draw here, but probably they want to see what else the person could do. So anyhow, Reshevsky and Stahlberg keep playing, and they go to the next diagram. Son of a gun, here we are, move 14.
Still
And
symmetrical.
we're as symmetrical as we can be.
Wow. If this had to happen in a tournament today, like everyone would write it off as a draw immediately.
Oh, well, that's what I said.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and here we are again. Think about it. If you were white at a tournament, your opponent played knight to d6 and looked up and said draw in a certain obvious tone, what are the odds you would take it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sure. But what does Reshevsky do? He uses the move.
Mm-hmm.
By playing bishop to g5, play a few moves and just see what happens to a position that's been dead symmetrical for 14 moves. And suddenly he's got the 7th rank.
Mm.
And he also has the 2 bishops raking on the queen's side. It doesn't matter that he has an isolated pawn because he now basically controls the future of the game.
Yeah. So even with the symmetry, when you said he has the move, it's, white goes first. So white is still
That's exactly right. See, that's something people can understand.
Mm.
And normally people don't look to Sammy Reshevsky to study his games. But, you watch the guy play, he had a purpose for everything. That's why he used to get in time trouble so much. I mean, I used to watch him play, because he was always at some tournament I was at. And I mean, it was just absolutely incredible. He would spend so much time, but his moves had really good reasons.
Yeah, to go from completely symmetrical to suddenly
completely won. Yeah. Capablanca Janowski, the only real symmetry part of it was the 4 knights. Most people consider that a draw. But what I love about Capablanca in this is that you get into this position. Now, in a lot of games, you'll see d4 and ed and queen takes. But Capablanca is like, no, I'm going to play d3 and I'm going to play really slowly. And he has a plan. And I love this plan.
Yeah.
Now here's the stop part. The bishop now is on h5. The weak square now becomes f5, and his knights, if you look at both of those knights, they're going to end up there at some point. Somebody's going to end up there, either from e3 or h4. And Capablanca just ends up coming down the f file, and Janowski's just, he has nothing to do. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's
wow.
this is Capablanca at his effortless best.
Hmm.
And look at this position. I think most amateurs at this point would realize white's better here.
Yeah.
Look at the pressure on the F file. Yeah, and of course he exchanges because the more pieces they get off the board, he doubles the rooks, and black is going to be passive for a long, long time.
Oh,
And he figures, he'll do it.
yeah. Wow. Fact that opposite sides castling, but white decides to push on the
Yeah,
side anyway.
and then he throws in a lesson with B4 at some point in here.
Here. Double exclamation marks.
Yeah, and the reason I did that is because when you first study the exchange variation, they always teach you. Max Erva did it years ago. He did a study to show that if you post the pawns on C4 and A4 and B3, they can stop those four black pawns no matter what. They can't force their way through. So that's like a rudimentary lesson that you do, with your students. Here, Capablanca does the opposite by sticking B4 out there because he can't move the C pawn up because then black will get counterplay on the D file. So Capablanca is then showing us there's another way to stop the advance, and in the meantime he can go quicker with the king pawn opening. So it's just so much fun to see this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then if I had to talk about one other thing in position play, Kayford, game 59, is on page 223. In every volume, I put stuff on the Ruy Lopez because I'm convinced that amateurs can understand the Ruy Lopez. It's not all that hard.
Would you say this is your recommended opening for amateurs for black?
What I do is I say, learn to play chess, then after you've done that, play the Ruy Lopez.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
that's my recommendation. In other words, I give enough other things to do
Yeah.
because the Ruy Lopez is very daunting for beginners. But once you start getting up towards 1800, you're going to find that your opponents don't mind playing into the Scotch Gambit or the Goring Gambit or the King's Gambit because look, I played E5 practically my whole life in response to E4. You got a gambit? Have at it.
Yeah.
And then as you get stronger players, they all have their little system against any little gambit thing that you have. This is a wonderful book that Alex Fishbein did, The Scotch Gambit.
Yeah, we have this.
Yeah, you guys have it. And it's terrific. Alex is a friend of mine, so I enjoy the privilege of that. And what I've done is I've been playing this online a whole lot, and you can see that, down at the bottom of the page, I said, well, there are the alternatives.
Yeah.
And here's some results from actual games. And here's another example. If you don't write in your opening books, you're not studying the opening.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
I go through that. And this is a great book. When I play it online, oh my goodness. I win like 90% of my games against people, with that.
Yeah.
But if I'm gonna, like I said, as an expert, I'm not gonna play that against a master. I'm gonna use 500 years of chess history against him, with the Ruy Lopez. And let's see what you got against the Ruy Lopez.
Okay.
And there's this wonderful game with Kayford. It's a correspondence game. It's not an atypical Ruy Lopez position. It looks like one. Like if you just gave that position out and said, what opening was this? 9 out of 10 people would probably say Ruy Lopez. Looks like one of those. But Tony Kayford played rook to A2 here. And I gave that a double exclamation mark. First of all, amateurs have a tough time thinking in terms of when they're attacking to go backwards.
Yeah.
One of my favorite games, this guy made a couple of backwards bishop moves in order to mate a king. It was a wonderful game. Fridlisius, that's the guy's name. Made all these backward bishop moves to get back to the king side so he can help in the mating attack of the white king. And I was like, oh wow, that's cool. And here's another example. White went from A6 to A2. And then it struck me. When I was in the military, we studied Alexander the Great. You study the old guys.
Yeah.
Because they knew how to move troops around and what you had to do. Alexander had a smaller force usually than the Persians, but he used the principle of interior lines. Like he kept his group compact, so there was excellent communication between the various wings, between the left wing and the right wing of the formations. So if he needed somebody to help bolster the right wing, and he would go send a messenger over to the left wing and say, hey, get the cavalry over here. We need them over here. And that's what Kafir did here. And I call this the, chess according to Alexander the Great, because it reminded me, and watch what happens. He has complete control of the A file, and then see what happens. Oh, and that's another great reason, too. He puts the bishop there rather than a knight earlier, but you'd have to go see the whole game. But look at this, and now the two rooks,
sweeping up.
They're ready to join in the fray.
Yeah, because the open A file looks so nice, but the attack.
Yeah, but it's empty space. And black hasn't got time to get his guys over, really. And now the rooks are doing their demolition job over there. And what's interesting is Capablanca does have his game in there, where he does the same thing against the open defense to the Ruy Lopez. So, and this is a nice way to, and now the attack just blasts through.
Yeah.
And that's the wonderful thing about it. So, I think it's important for people to study games like this, because this is more than just about the Ruy Lopez. It's about, gee, can I do this and other things? Do I keep my lines of communication open?
Yeah.
Do I have the ability to go backwards? Because sometimes people put pieces even in an aggressive place, then they realize they can't get out anymore.
Yeah.
Sometimes people learn that with the queen knight pawn thing, where you don't take it because you sleep in the streets or whatever. Everybody knows that one. But, this is a whole nother deal. These are ideas that I will always remember. I may not remember all the moves of the Ruy Lopez. I mean, I've gone, maybe 18, 19 moves of Ruy Lopez without knowing what I'm doing in terms of theory.
Yeah.
But because I've understood what everybody was trying to teach me, I found that I was following theory because I understood where everybody goes.
Just by following games and seeing the ideas play out. Yeah,
it's so important. With these 3 books together, I have 900 pages of chess games with lessons, and there are 200 games in here in the 3. I remember when I was a kid, we used to go gaga over David Bronstein's 200 open games. It was a little tiny thin book, and he hardly annotated the things. He just told stories, and I loved them. We all loved them. And there are a gazillion Ruy Lopez's in there, and because he even felt that was important. You play over those games and you get an idea of what to play. But this time I take the time out to explain things to people.
Yeah.
And there's a guy I heard from Germany. His name was Gunther. Right, that was in the second one. Yeah, he read Openings for Amateurs, and then in Next Steps, I have the letter he wrote. He wrote a letter, for heaven's sakes. He says, I bought your Openings for Amateurs some days ago, and I was thrilled. I consider it one of the best opening books ever written, perhaps the best. Well, that's a bit much. Thanks.
A compliment.
But here's the point. He says, I've been playing chess for 65 years. Good, Gunnar, so we're the same age. I used to play on board one of a fairly big chess club and often had to face players who would be rated over 2,000 on today's rating list. In those days, there were no computers or databases, but gradually the situation began to change, and today my opponents know their openings very well. So I started playing offbeat openings or quiet systems, and I wasn't able to learn and memorize hundreds of openings, variations, and sub-variations. He says, your book has provided me with a new outlook on the openings. It isn't an opening manual, but it teaches you how to play in the opening stage and how to play chess in general. It stimulated my appetite to play old openings again. And I am grateful to you for having written this book. It ranks a top place on my chess library. Well, Gunther is the voice of a whole lot of old people older people that, most people are kind of weekend warriors every now and then. I mean, most of your chess players are people that, don't treat it seriously as a profession,
Yeah. They have jobs, they have lives outside of
Yeah.
chess.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I had that. I was teaching advanced courses. I was coaching college basketball. I was raising three boys and then coaching their little league basketball stuff at night when I got home.
Mhm.
And, I don't have time to study, or I didn't. So for all the Gunthers in the world, I try to make these very friendly, plain spoken, and I try to tell you a very important thing is that I don't just give like a plus over equals or a plus over minus or an equal. I tell you why.
Mm.
Well, what do you do from here? That's a key question.